Welcome to today's episode of HilltopTalks Politics and Finance podcast series for 2024, where we delve into the intricate world of politics and finance at the federal, state, and local levels in the United States, and where we often concentrate on issues related to U.S. public finance and the U.S. municipal bond market, as we will again today. I'm Tom Kozlik, the head of public policy and municipal strategy at Hilltop Securities. Today's episode is the 7th for 2024, and today's guest is a distinguished journalist, author, and now producer who has provided profound insights into the financial challenges and ongoing rebirth of one of America's most iconic cities. Nathan Bomey is the author of the critically acclaimed and one of my favorite books, Detroit Resurrected, to Bankruptcy and Back, and he is a producer of the new, compelling, and award-winning documentary, Gradually, Then Suddenly, The Bankruptcy of Detroit. Nathan's work not only chronicles the financial missteps that led to Detroit's historic bankruptcy, but also highlights the resilience and recovery that has followed and is in process. Nathan's expertise and the stories he unravels, I'd say, extend beyond just Detroit, offering us valuable lessons for city government, for municipal bond investors, and finance students alike. Today, we're going to explore Detroit's bankruptcy as it was used to manage the city's legacy liabilities. We're going to focus on the lessons that can be learned, and we're also going to consider the real-life impact on Detroit's citizens and its pensioners. Please join me in welcoming Nathan to the podcast. Nathan, thank you so much for making time to join us today.
I'm so excited to be here. I never pass up the chance to talk about Detroit.
Excellent. And also, I really want to express the appreciation for you keeping me up to date on the new documentary, Gradually, Then Suddenly, The Bankruptcy of Detroit. Before we get into the details of the film, though, I wanted to share with our listeners about how I came to know you and your work, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Detroit officially filed for bankruptcy in the summer of 2013, over 10 years ago. And I clearly remember reading an article of yours, Nathan, titled How Detroit Went Broke. The answers may surprise you, and don't blame Coleman Young in early fall of 2013 after the bankruptcy was filed. And you wrote this specifically in that article, and I clearly remember reading, the Free Press examined about 10,000 pages of documents gathering dust in the public library's archives. Since most of those documents have never been digitized, and remember, this is 10 years ago, the Free Press created its own database of 50 years of Detroit's financial history. And honestly, that just sounded like so much fun for me. And that's why it is that I remembered that. But what my initial question for you, what was it that drew you to this story, or was it just your next assignment?
Well, I was covering General Motors at the Detroit Free Press, and so I was just kind of minding my own business. And on one day, it became obvious that Detroit was headed toward this financial calamity, and the newsroom leaders said, we're going to gather a team of folks who have some experience in covering bankruptcy and want to get your thoughts on how we might approach this. And so, since in previous jobs I had covered some major bankruptcies, I said, sure, I'll happily be involved. And that's where I thought it would end. I thought I'd end up sort of chipping in a little bit here and there, but didn't think I'd be integrally involved. And then a few weeks later, all of a sudden I'm at another meeting and they announced our plan of attack. And they said, and we're going to do an exhaustive story on the history of Detroit's finances. And we're going to assign that to John Gallagher and Nathan Bomey. And I did a double take and I said, I'm sorry, who did you say was doing this again? John was a veteran journalist at the Free Press, had been there 30 years. I had been there only a couple of years. And it was a great team because he had the institutional knowledge and I had sort of the newcomer's perspective to, I wasn't coming in with pre-existing opinions about how Detroit went broke. And so this story led me to the basement of the Detroit Public Library's historical collection, because when assigned something like this, I did what any old millennial would do, which is I Googled it and there was nothing there, basically, because Detroit's finances, as you mentioned, really didn't exist online prior to about 2002 or so. So I ended up in finding, I needed to figure out, where do these records exist? Well, The city of Detroit was so broke that their own internal library no longer had the records. And the checked in with the Wayne State University Library. They didn't have it. Nobody had it except for the Detroit Public Library. We had to go deep into the archives, and I'm looking through the audits from the city of Detroit back to the 50s and annual audits. And I essentially went audit by audit, year by year, and accumulated this database of finances, of data that cast a light on how the city went from one of the wealthiest places in the world, a place of that helped build the middle class, helped put the world on wheels, to a place that was truly broken and broke. And so it was a fascinating assignment, and it still is a story that resonates today.
And the assignment the result was the article that I just mentioned. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Okay. And it that story went viral, and it got us a lot of attention. And so that ended up kind of catapulting me into more coverage of the bankruptcy. And as soon I became the lead bankruptcy reporter for the Free Press. And so I was kind of leading the team in the day-to-day coverage of the courtroom proceedings and the bigger picture story of how Detroit was navigating Chapter 9.
So then at what point did you think about the fact that what you were working on could fill a book? Like when were you influenced to then kind of take it to the next step and say, you know what, this is going to be something. It's going to be, I don't know when you titled it Detroit Resurrected, but how and when did that happen?
Well, the bankruptcy, like you said, started in July of 2013, and this How Detroit Went Broke story ran in September of 2013. By early the next year, I had already started to realize this could make a really great book. And I thought to myself, when this is over, I might pursue that. And as luck would have it, before that even happened, I got contacted by an agent who had seen my work and thought that it was, compelling and maybe worthy of a book. And I asked if I was interested in potentially pursuing one. I said yes. And I essentially ended up putting a book proposal together. She agreed to represent me. And then from there, we ended up pitching publishers. And that's how the book deal ended up happening.
Okay. We can and probably should do a refresh podcast about Detroit Resurrected, but I want to concentrate more on the documentary, but I am going to jump into one part of the book because I think it's going to set the stage well for the documentary. You start chapter 9 of the book by writing, "If bankruptcy is a storming sea, bankruptcy attorneys are pirates who roam the waters." And my question isn't necessarily about that. I just thought that was a very descriptive and good. I thought that was a good lead-in. My question is more about what you wrote a couple of pages later, where you wrote that about restructuring professionals generally. You wrote, "When examining a distressed company, they remove their personal feelings from the equation. They're like surgeons. If they get emotionally involved in the lives of their patients, they won't be able to do their jobs." And I'm wondering if you could share with our listeners what it is that you meant by that.
Yeah. So if you go to the ER and your arm is in bad shape, and the physician, you don't want a physician who's emotionally involved. You want a physician who says, "We need to cut the arm off to save the rest of your body," or "Here's how we're going to survive. Here's how we're going to save your arm. And we can do this in a very logical and unemotional way." Because, anytime someone goes to the ER, something really bad has happened. And the same thing with bankruptcy. Anytime a company, or a city in this case, ends up in bankruptcy, something really bad has happened. And what you need people who are capable of looking at the case in as unemotional of a way as possible, so that they can approach it and help this company or city in this case get back on its feet, or make decisions that ultimately lead to a different resolution. And so it's both a good thing and a bad thing, in the sense that, you need someone who can do that unemotionally. On the other hand, when you deal with something like a city, in this case, the city of Detroit, with nearly 700,000 people, 32,000 pensioners, 66,000 pieces of art, this is a city that is filled with emotions and filled with history. And so whatever you do, whatever decisions you make with regard to the future of the city inside the context of bankruptcy, is going to lead to an explosion of emotion. And so what you have this extremely emotional impact colliding with extremely unemotional folks. And so that leads to a lot of friction. And it doesn't necessarily mean the outcome is bad, but it does mean that there's going to be a lot of tension. And you certainly saw that in Detroit.
And that might be a really good lead into the discussion about the documentary itself, to tell you the truth. Great.
Yeah.
And I want to turn to the documentary. Gradually, then suddenly, The Bankruptcy of Detroit. Let me tell you, it was very powerful. It was very well done. I think it was a great in-depth look at the events leading up to, during, following the bankruptcy. I thought the film captured the nuance and the complex financial, political, and social dynamics, and the emotion that you were just talking about.
Yeah.
I think there was enough detail for an analyst like myself to be really captured by it, but I think it's also general enough for a more general audience to take a lot away from it.
And I'm glad to hear you say that too, because it was a challenge for us to balance the two, because we wanted to be faithful to the details of the case and the financial aspects of it, while also, understanding this is a human story, and nobody really wants to watch except for you and I, Tom, a documentary about all the inner workings of the finances of the case. And so it's like, how do you combine the two? And That's where we had to strike a balance. The book, I don't think I did as good of a job in the book as explaining the emotions of the story, that the film does a much better job of that. And on the flip side, if you really want to dig into all the specifics of the financial aspects, then you do need to read the book. But I think that the film does at least a faithful job of explaining what happened.
Well, as I think about it, I think that hearing people's voices and also the time, and one of the questions I was going to ask you was why now, and maybe one of the reasons of why it is why now is because it allows it to settle a little, right? But I think that hearing those people's voices, and I think, and I'm going to ask you a little bit more, but hearing those people's voices really did bring it. It made it much more. It brought it alive. The way that's how I would describe it.
Yeah, and it helps you understand the real world impact that this had on people, and that's powerful. And I think it explains better the sort of the way that Kevin Orr, as the emergency manager for the city of Detroit, had to navigate this. It explains maybe how the creditors, the background as the creditors were approaching their negotiations. It explains what the retirees were facing, and it doesn't necessarily change your perspective on what was the best way to handle this, but it does give you a better sense of the broader ramifications of it. And you're right. I think one of the advantages the film has over the book is just the passage of time. The fact that you get a better sense for what resonates over time, and versus the book came out, about less than 2 years after the bankruptcy ended. And so that was a little more of an immediate inside story of the case. And this is a little bit more of the broader story, I think.
Let me tell you, though, whenever I pick up that book, it's hard for me to put it down still over 10 years later, just so you know. Yeah. So that book is a very, very important read for people. And I would say that this documentary is a very important and much watch for folks who are interested in public finance, urban governance, the resilience of communities. I wanted to include...
There's a lot more profanity in the book than in the film.
There was some profanity in the beginning of the film.
Yeah, a little bit there as well.
Yeah. As the title implies, as the documentary title implies, this is a process that occurred kind of over time. And like you wrote in that piece in 2013 that you were talking about, and when you wrote this, you were talking about, you wrote this in 2013, but you were talking about 2005. You wrote, although no one could see it at the time, Detroit's insolvency was guaranteed. And that really, it didn't strike me back in 2013 when I read it as much as now going back and reading it. It strikes me, and I think it really fits in with the story that you and the team are trying to tell. And one of the first things that I wanted to ask is, why was it so important 10 years later to return to this and tell this story in a documentary? Was it to capture that emotion? Like, what was it that What was it that made you and this group return?
I think that the story of Detroit just resonates throughout the world for a lot of different reasons, and is important to continue to examine for a lot of different reasons as well. I mean, I think for starters, like I mentioned before, a city that helped establish the middle class, helped put the world on wheels, helped preserve democracy for the world. This was the arsenal of democracy that during World War II transformed itself into this powerhouse of production for the Allies to help defeat the axis of evil during World War II. And so to see
How did it do
city,
that?
yeah,
I know I've heard you say this before, but remind our listeners about how did that happen?
basically by completely changing its economy overnight, by converting manufacturing facilities that were producing cars and other parts to facilities that were producing planes and weapons for the U.S. military. I remember covering the demise of a facility in Willow Run, Michigan, where the B-24 bombers would literally roll out of the factory, roll onto the airport, and roll all the way out to the war. Like just that, it was that kind of efficiency.
Right.
That Southeast Michigan and Detroit were engaged in during the war. And so to see a city go from a place where it was helping preserve democracy for the world to then get to a place where democracy was suspended in 2013 because of what had happened to it, I think it's such a dynamic story. And I think that really resonates today as we just have these discussions about what does democracy mean to us. And I think that may be part of the story that resonates more today than it did back then, at least for me. And then also, I just think we have to learn from the stories like this. We have to learn from what happened to Detroit. Politicians need to learn that someday the bill will come due for the decisions that you've made over time. You may not pay the bill, but someone will. I mean, in the film, one of the commentators says that a lot of times the person holding the bag gets the blame, but the seeds were sown a long time ago. And the person who sowed the seeds, they're the person that often deserves the blame. And it's hard for us, I think, those of us who are affected by decisions in the current day to blame those people back then. We want to blame the people who are in front of us. There was another compelling line in the film, also in the book, from Kevin Orr, the emergency manager. He says that there are deals on Wall Street, like the one in 2005 that you mentioned, and that ultimately led to Detroit's insolvency, that on Wall Street are called IBG, YBG deals, meaning I'll be gone, you'll be gone, and nobody will have to deal with the consequences. Well, the truth is that the citizens of the city will have to deal with the consequences, and that means that they will pay the bill. And in Detroit's case, that meant lower pensions, and it meant bondholders who got cut, and it meant all kinds of implications for the sake of a city that operates better now and has a brighter future, but doesn't mean that there wasn't pain to get there.
One of the other lines in the documentary, there was someone who's referring to the filing as a hostile takeover, and then they said in Eastern Europe they'd call something like this a coup. Now, I look at this from a financial lens, right? And so many of these things made sense to me, but I hadn't thought about it like that. Was that kind of the consensus, or was that a fringe view?
I definitely think that was a common opinion among Detroiters, that the governor of Michigan, who in this case happened to be a white Republican, had appointed essentially a receiver, in this case, a emergency manager, to take over the city of Detroit and usurp the local politicians, essentially rendering them powerless. Now, he could accept their insight and their input and their advice, but he did not have to follow that. And so that was a very controversial thing. But I will say that it's very important to note that the bankruptcy judge during the case, Stephen Rhodes, who not necessarily known as a conservative, ruled that the emergency manager appointment was a constitutional appointment and that it was not undemocratic because the state of Michigan is responsible for overseeing the city of Detroit and every other municipality under its wing, that ultimately the city of Detroit is a creation of the state government. And therefore, the governor of Michigan and the legislature, they're still representing the people of Detroit, and therefore the democracy is still in place. Now, local democracy suspended, but overall, they still have democratic representation. So that's the other side of the argument. And I do think it's important to note, Sheila Cockrell, former city council member in Detroit, is quoted in the film saying, it was upsetting essentially, but something had to be done because the city of Detroit was spiraling downward toward a place of true destruction.
And one of the things that was asked in the film and answered, it was asked, who did this to Detroit? And I think one of the city communications directors said, we did this to Detroit. Was that clear and detailed enough? I guess it was clear and detailed enough for the documentary. To me, that, and maybe on the one hand, I guess I've been following this very, very closely, but it didn't seem to offer the detail that like your 2013 article did. Was there a conscious decision to, I mean, you didn't leave it at that. I mean, there was some detail, but there wasn't as much detail about the spiraling that happened for decades as opposed to going over into detail about the grand bargain. Like, was that a conscious decision that you made, that you and the group made with regard to the documentary?
We really wrestled for a long time about how much history do we delve into, because there's just so much, as I say in the book, everyone has an opinion about how Detroit went broke. And in reality, everybody is right, because there is a piece of it, there's so many pieces of it that are legitimate reasons to say why Detroit went broke. I mean, suburbanization, racist real estate practices, the decline of the auto industry, the explosion of all the debt that the city did over time, mismanagement, corruption, so many things. And the truth is, there's truth in every single one of them. And that's why I'm compelled by that quote in the doc, because because what it says to me is, we did this, meaning this was not some, we sat by the side while this was happening. And so when someone finally decided to do something about it, they got the blame, but the reality is that the blame should be assigned to people who are long gone.
So I'm wondering, do you think that there is a inherent conflict between the different parties, between the emergency manager, between the politicians at the local level, at the state level, between the restructuring professionals that you mentioned, and then even the interests of the people living in Detroit? Like, is there an inherent conflict there?
Massive conflict. And I think it's impossible to tell this story without understanding the motivations that each actor had, and the conflict between those motivations. So for starters, the elected politicians of the city of Detroit are like any other politician in any other city or state, which is their number one goal is to get reelected. And I think over time, in a city that's getting smaller and smaller and smaller, it's very difficult to tell your constituents that we can't afford to do X, Y, and Z anymore, or we can't afford to pay this level of pensions anymore, because that's going to have political consequences. But political courage, it dictates that we don't promise to people things that we can't deliver. And I think that that's one of the big lessons of this city from a political standpoint. Now, in terms of the motivations of people who were involved in the case, the restructuring professionals and the lawyers who were involved in the case, these are folks who are among the best compensated people in this business, and they're getting paid quite a lot of money. Now, I'm not here to say that they were doing this solely for the paycheck necessarily. I'm sure some were, but they were getting paid very well. I think for some of them, they truly wanted a great outcome for the city or for their clients, in the case of the financial creditors, for example. Others, Kevin Orr himself took some heat at the beginning of the bankruptcy when he called it the Olympics of financial restructuring, which I think crossed some people the wrong way, because it sounded like a game to him. And I do think it is a bit of a game to some people in this industry. And that's why I kind of made that comparison in the book. And so, but I think for some people, they had good motivations. And ultimately, the governor of Michigan, who appointed Kevin Orr, he was facing re-election too. So was his, some people think he was motivated to help save the Detroit Institute of Arts for that reason. So there's all sorts of motivations. But you mentioned it, and I want to mention this, which is the number one thing I always tried to do in the book and in the film is to keep the people of the city itself in mind, that the city's residents ultimately are the one people who did not have much of a voice And ultimately, they were the most important constituent in this case. They're the people who are just waiting for the streetlights to get back on. They're waiting for their tax dollars to be used efficiently, for the police to come when there's a major crime, for the streets to get plowed when it snows. Just these basic things that I think we have come to expect as citizens of this country that people in the city of Detroit did not have. They needed a voice. So I always tried to keep that in mind, that I need to tell a story that's faithful to everybody involved, but keeping in mind that they may not have a voice, and they really do deserve a voice, because ultimately they're the ones who are going to have to live with the city after the fact.
So one of the things that what I wanted to jump into next was talking about the grand bargain, because that's what it is that seemed to be a decent focus of the documentary. Correct me if I'm wrong. Was that done on purpose?
Yeah, and I think because it's really the compelling story of how this was resolved.
So could you describe the grand bargain for our listeners? Because maybe not all of our listeners have read the book and or seen the documentary yet. So could you describe it, set it up and describe it for us?
Yeah, the grand bargain was this term that came to be used, actually coined by the Detroit Free Press, to describe a deal that helped end the Detroit bankruptcy. It was truly a grand bargain because it involved the contribution of hundreds of millions of dollars by philanthropic organizations who were tapped by the mediators in the bankruptcy to help contribute funds that would be used to essentially reduce the pension cuts that would have been otherwise extreme for the pensioners, and then in exchange for that, preserve the Detroit Institute of Arts, which was owned by the city of Detroit, and make that an independent institution, because the DIA was at risk of possible liquidation or the sale of some of its prized assets during this bankruptcy. And so the mediator in the bankruptcy, Gerald Rosen, came up with this idea to marry the two of them, marry their fates together, the pensioners and the art, to say, if we can get this money, we can raise this money, and we can basically help then convince the pensioners not to go after the art, and then the DIA will accept this deal. They'll end up as an independent institution. This grand bargain led to the resolution of the bankruptcy, but it's important to note, not a grand bargain that everyone appreciated, or even to this day likes. I think a lot of the pensioners are still angry about it to this day. A lot of the bondholders, the financial creditors, still feel like they got a raw deal as well. But I think in some ways, whenever everyone's unhappy about a deal, in some ways that can be a good sign.
How did the citizens react to the grand bargain?
I think a lot of them were glad it was finally over. Mm-hmm. Others, I think, were especially appreciative of the fact that the DIA was not going to be liquidated, which would have led to this gap, this huge gap in Midtown Detroit, a neighborhood that was on the move at that point in a positive direction. To undercut that momentum would have been really just terrible. Others, I think, felt like this was the city of Detroit getting stripped of one of its major assets, even though it didn't actually go anywhere. The city no longer owned it, which was unusual to begin with. Cities don't usually own museums, but through a quirk of history, the city of Detroit still owned the DIA, and that was actually honestly reflective of the city's former wealth, that they still owned it. And then I think a lot of people still upset about those pension cuts, but the truth is they could have been so much worse. That was going to be my next. Yeah, go ahead.
That was going to be my next question. How hard was it, do you recall, to get the pensioners to buy into the grand bargain?
I think a lot of people thought it was going to be much more difficult than it ended up being. And I think the fact that the pensioners ended up casting ballots as creditors in the bankruptcy to accept the grand bargain by a large margin, it was something like 75% of the general pensioners, and then more than 80% of the police and fire pensioners voted to accept the deal. That was reflective of the fact that they understood that this deal was the best way forward. So even though you may still hear people complaining about, in the end, they did accept it. And I thought that vote of sacrifice is pretty remarkable. You don't see that much in politics or in society, that people would accept cuts like this, because they could have kept fighting. There was a chance that they could have gotten a court in the future to say that those pension cuts are illegal. I don't think that would have happened, but they certainly had a chance and they could have kept fighting. Instead, they agreed to take the deal for the sake of a better Detroit in the future.
So is the grand bargain, is that type of a solution? Is that something that you think could be transferable to other situations and or other cities?
In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. I think in the sense that most cities don't have a major asset like the DIA that could be used as the catalyst for a broader deal. And in some ways, Detroit was lucky to have that, because I don't know what they would have done if they didn't have that as a sort of a cudgel to use to try to get a deal. On the other hand, I think it is a lesson, because what it tells us, what it shows us, is a roadmap to compromise. And compromise is a dirty word in American politics. Nobody wants to do it, but that's how democracy works. We have to have compromise to get some sort of brighter future, and that's ultimately what happened here. You had people, we had Republicans in Lansing and Democrats in Lansing, the state capital of Michigan, who agreed to contribute to this. They both were upset about the way this was being resolved, but they also understood that they couldn't get everything they wanted, and that you can't, as the famous saying from the bankruptcy goes, you can't eat principles, in the sense that, at the end of the day, you have your principles, but you may have to compromise, because there are folks on the other side who have a stake in this too.
Is this, and when I say this, I don't necessarily mean the grand bargain, I mean the situation. Do you think that this should be considered a cautionary tale for other U.S. cities?
Absolutely. I mean, the city of Detroit and its collapse, is a huge cautionary tale, because Detroit, in a lot of ways, has always been the extreme version of this sort of situation, and continues, during this case, to be the extreme. It's, of course, the biggest bankruptcy in Chapter 9 bankruptcy in U.S. history, and the most debt, and the most all these things. But that doesn't mean it's not a real serious cautionary tale, because there were other major municipalities throughout the country. I think about Chicago, for example, with its massive pension deficit. And maybe that's improved a little bit in the near term, but in the long term, a lot of cities are going to face serious challenges if they don't right-size their budgets, or make the difficult decisions that are necessary to make sure that you have a sustainable budget in the future. And that these things come in waves. We may have a lot of municipalities right now that are in good financial condition, but down the road there'll be more challenges, and Detroit will be illustrative of what can happen when a great city goes broke.
One of the things that I didn't fully appreciate as much when I read the book as opposed to when I saw the documentary is embedded at the beginning of the documentary, which could also be another cautionary tale as I think about it, is one that underscores, in my opinion, the critical importance of local government reporting. And this is something that over the last decade or so, as I see small newspapers and or those types of newspapers being consolidated and or eliminated, it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, that the Detroit Free Press played a very pivotal role in the uncovering and reporting of the story of Detroit's financial crisis. I'm wondering, first of all, am I onto something? And
absolutely.
Okay. Well, could you talk about that a little bit? Because then I'm going to ask you a more general question, but could you talk about that? So I was catching on to something that the storytellers in the documentary were trying to get across.
Yeah. No,
Okay.
this is, I couldn't agree more that the local media in Michigan were essential to telling this story and to keeping the officials involved accountable. And let me take it even further back and give you a bit of a backstory of my own personal history in journalism, because it really does enlighten this aspect of the story. So I started in journalism at age 17 in my hometown in Saline, Michigan. I ended up, through a series of events,
Right near Ann Arbor.
Correct, near Ann Arbor. I ended up writing for the community newspaper in my hometown during my senior year in high school, and continued to do so during my 4 years in college as a commuter to the local public university. And I I don't know why, but the editor trusted me to go cover the local township board of trustees at age 17, 18 years old. I'm covering these monthly meetings where they're debating things like septic zoning and local quarry regulations and how much to fund the public safety budget and all these things. And so fast forward to when I end up at the Detroit Free Press, end up covering the bankruptcy, and people ask me, well, how did you know how to go through a city budget and that sort of thing? Well, I said, because I was a local reporter covering local city government. It was just a smaller version of what this is. I knew how to look at a budget. I knew what I was looking at. And so I was prepared for that because I had the training in local journalism that I needed to do it on a bigger scale, even though in the time between I had started to do business journalism. And so, I think that those are the kind of jobs that are gone today that we are missing because if you don't have those types of reporters, you can't cover a story like this the way that we could at the Free Press. And it wasn't just me. The Free Press had a team of people who were covering this story and playing a key role in chronicling it, because I think we felt like we had a real responsibility to explain this to the people of Detroit. A lot of folks who needed to understand this really complicated story. How is this going to affect me? The pensioners, they need to know how this is going to affect their day-to-day finances. The people who were just waiting for the streetlights to come back on, they needed to know this was going to impact their community, their actual neighborhood. And so we felt like we had a public service responsibility. And then there was the broader community, the financial community, the legal community, the philanthropic community, the art world. There were so many people who were relying on us to tell this story. And if we weren't there as local media, this story doesn't get told in the same way.
So that answers my next question. Will the decline in local government press coverage over the last decade or so, is that going to be an element missing potentially the next time that there's it really will. Yeah. Okay.
It really will. And I think, we even, during this case, I think we should also note that there are secret elements of federal court cases like this that you need reporters to sort of be there as a guard against excessive secrecy. There were secret mediation proceedings during this case, which you can certainly argue should be secret, but you can also argue that this is a city government whose fate is being decided behind closed doors. And so we did the best job we could do to try to report on what was actually happening behind closed doors. And those types of things will be lost if we don't invest in local journalism. I mean, it's absolutely essential. I'm a huge believer in local journalism, and I work at Axios now, which is a national news publication, but we have local reporters in 30 cities throughout the country because we think it's essential to journalism.
So I'm going to get back to Detroit. I'm going to close with a question. I'm going to make an observation, then I'm going to ask you a final question. I was back in Detroit in the spring of 2024 for the first time in a number of years. I toured some of the economic development projects that are helping to bring Detroit back. In your opinion, are Detroit's best days ahead or behind?
Well, that's a tough question because I think Detroit will never get back to what it was in the 50s, for example, when it was nearly 2 million people, one of the most bustling places in America. But I think that Detroit does have a brighter future ahead of it than it has in the last 10 to 20 years. And honestly, it's shocking to see how much better the condition of Detroit is today than it was when I started at the Detroit Free Press in 2012, or even 10 years before that. The city of Detroit is on the move and in a positive direction. And you absolutely never would have been able to say that without the bankruptcy. The bankruptcy of the city of Detroit helped cut the city's budget to a point where they can actually afford to pay the bills, and they can afford to start to do things like to actually tear down the abandoned homes that were such a blight on the city's property, and thus the city's property tax revenue. And I just heard recently they only have about 5,000 blighted structures left. When the bankruptcy started, it was something like 60 or 70,000 structures that were blighted. And so that just illustrates in a very tangible way how the city's improved finances is directly improving the lives of the people who live in the city, and is setting the city up for the investors to come back. And you're already seeing that. If you look at what Ford did with the train station, I don't know if you got a chance to see it, but incredible what they've done rehabbing this old train station that was left for dead, that is now this nearly $1 billion project that is revitalizing the Corktown neighborhood. You've got Dan Gilbert about to open a massive skyscraper in downtown, first skyscraper in downtown Detroit in decades. That is incredibly encouraging. And I think the neighborhoods are gradually improving too. But the truth is that Detroit faces massive challenges. It will face massive challenges for many years to come. A city that still has a pretty broken education system, that still has too high of a jobless rate, that still has too much crime. All these things are very, still very significant problems, and you have to be clear-eyed about that. But the truth is that the city has a much brighter future, and it is a much healthier position today than it was when it filed for bankruptcy.
So Nathan, do me a favor. Tell me where it is that our listeners can find the book, and how is it that they can watch the documentary?
You should be able to buy the book, Detroit Resurrected, at any online source at this point. It's almost 10 years old, so you probably won't see it in the bookstore, but you can certainly find it on Amazon and Barnes & Noble's website and your local bookstore's website. You can try bookshop.org if you want to order from a local bookshop. And the documentary, really excited to say that it's finally on streaming services this year. This is really exciting to get it out there. So you can stream the documentary for free on YouTube or Tubi. You can also rent it on Google Play or on Amazon. And in fact, you actually will probably be able to find it on most any other streaming service as well. So it's pretty much all the major streaming services. Just look up Gradually, Then Suddenly, The Bankruptcy of Detroit. Super proud to have served as the principal scriptwriter and producer on the film. It was a project that took nearly a decade, which is just incredible to say that it's finally out there for the world to see.
Well, it was well worth the wait, and I think, as you were describing, it absolutely captures the emotion that you and your group were trying to get across, in my opinion.
I appreciate it. I think it's a really compelling watch. The story never gets old to me. I mean, Detroit is a remarkable place, and I think that its story is just as remarkable.
Well, thank you, Nathan, for joining us today, and I want to thank those who tuned in and downloaded our recording. We appreciate you listening, and I also wanted to remind folks that you can see the recent Hilltop Securities Economic and Municipal Commentary and listen to our podcast by going to hilltopsecurities.com/commentary, and you can follow me on Twitter and LinkedIn. You can also follow Nathan on Twitter as well. Thanks again, everyone. We look forward to bringing you more color in the future related to topics that intersect the world of politics, finance, and public finance. This has been Tom Kozlik from Hilltop Securities.